environmental seminar today is going to be provided by Professor Reza Hasmath from the University of Alberta and our very own Dr. Timothy Hildebrandt. Their presentation is entitled The Altruistic Authoritarian Citizen, Understanding Non-Participation in Philanthropic and Volunteeristic Activities in Contemporary China. I'll do a quick bio of Reza and a quick bio of Tim, and then they will go ahead and take it over. So Reza is professor of political science at the University of Alberta. He has previously held faculty positions in management, sociology, and political science at the University of Toronto, Melbourne, and Oxford, and has worked for think tanks, consultancies, development agencies, and NGOs in the United States, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, and China, who have a wide experience in a number of different contexts and continents and countries. His award-winning research looks at evolving state-society relationships in authoritarian contexts. And Tim is an associate professor in our department of social policy. He is the editor of the China Quarterly, a political scientist by training. His China-related research examines NGO development, as well as the construction and performance of citizenship in the country. So without much ado, we introduce Reza and Timothy, and we look forward to the presentation that they're going to provide to us today. Take it over.
Thanks, Robtel. Thanks, everybody. Welcome. I'm just going to say I'm just going to ramble with a preamble and then pass it over to Reza, and then I'll take the baton back and then pass it back to him. Keep you on your toes. No, just thing that I wanted to say was, so what we're going to be presenting here today is not the final product. It's a work in progress, a developed work in progress, but a work in progress nonetheless. I had the privilege of presenting on a different project that we're working on with Guodong and Blake Miller last January, and we did a similar thing. It was like a work in progress. And I just wanted to say, for those who were there, incredibly useful. We gained so much from it. We have a working paper now. It's kind of nearly done, which is great. And essentially, yeah, this is just me saying, like, it's a work in progress. So we'd love to hear your thoughts. You're not getting a final word from us, but we hope that you find it as interesting as we have. Reza's going to give you a lot of context about where this came out of, and also you'll get a bit of a taste of where we're going in sort of the next stage.
Thank you, Tim. Lovely to meet everyone. So as Tim says, this is a work in progress. However, there are some key takeaways that you can use if you're a policymaker or if you're thinking about it theoretically. So of course, we're going to say it's a work in progress because we still need to do some, dotting the I's and crossing the T's, but there's a lot of refined things to talk about here. So the altruistic authoritarian citizen. You can see the title even expanded from our initial sort of presentation, and that tells you our thinking has also expanded in many respects. It's really interesting because we do see China is experiencing increased socioeconomic inequalities and reported social discontent in this decade. What we see is that the state's really reimagining the desired characteristics of this model citizen, particularly in philanthropy and volunteerism. So that's really exciting for researchers who are looking at this, because the state's actually shifting the way it conceives how a citizen should and should not behave. So to incentivize this sort of greater charitable donations and charitable giving and greater philanthropy, the state's come up with this messaging of common prosperity and to revive this idea of tertiary distribution. And the idea here is it's a sort of a philosophical argument to suggest that it's a responsibility of each Chinese citizen to financially contribute to those who are less well off. So it's really interesting to see that sort of significant shift. We also see, when we look at the World Giving Index, China's performed perhaps one of the worst countries in the world to do so. I have another paper at this trying to figure out, why does China not give when it's becoming wealthier and wealthier and wealthier? So it's in the interest of the state to try and engineer this sort of philanthropic sort of activities by telling citizens, hey, it's a good citizen does this. We also see that the state's signaling that it expects citizens to volunteer more. I'll give you some examples of this. In the 2017 speech, that Xi Jinping delivered to the National Congress. He suggested that the party state should build and institutionalize volunteering services, enhance citizens' sense of social responsibility. In the last 2 5-year plans, we see there's greater emphasis on voluntary activities. We see that they're trying to get citizens to actually participate in community services more effectively. So this is a long-winded way of saying to you, the good citizen is the one who donates, the good citizen is the one who volunteers. But why are we seeing the good citizen doing this effectively? Which is our problem. So given we're seeing this sort of signaling and disincentives and incentives to encourage the citizenry to engage in charitable giving and volunteerism, our attendant puzzle is why aren't we seeing citizens donating or volunteering? And why do we see there are these bad citizens effectively choosing not to? So this whole study is trying to figure out what are the bad citizens? What are their characteristics? What do they look like? How do policymakers actually, reach them? Can they reach them? Are they reaching them? Now, this is where the work in progress title comes into play, because we've been running, and I'll talk about the data in a bit for this particular paper. We've been running a data set since 2018 in 2-year intervals. So we call it the civic participation in China surveys. So we've done in 2018, 2020, 2022, and we're actually about to run it now. So the 2024 version is going to come out. So this paper is looking at that sort of data set. Tim and I maybe want to complicate our lives a bit more. We also developed a survey about the altruistic citizen. It's a completely new, different survey, which we ran this year. And we haven't tied it in fully, both surveys, and I guess methodologically there's some issues there, but we're going to present this, the civic participation stuff to you to give you some insights. But at the end of our presentation, we'll talk a bit more what we sort of found from the altruistic citizen, where we're talking about some of the psychological and sociological profile of that citizen. In other words, our main project effectively is to try and figure out who is this bad citizen, why don't they volunteer, why don't they donate, and what does this mean theoretically, but what does this mean for policymaking? So effectively, that is our sort of project here. Now, I'm going to give you a few background sort of framework that informs this particular paper we're presenting. Goes without saying for those in this room, is that citizenship is a construction. It's a social construction that's particular to a place and time. So really understanding the good and bad citizen, their needs, their desires, it's really locally understood. And particularly in an authoritarian environment, we're going to find different characteristics of what it means to be a good and bad citizen. Now, most states don't actually explicitly express a good citizen does this and a bad citizen conversely does that. The Chinese state makes it easier for us because we can point to the fact that they're saying a good citizen volunteers, a good citizen does philanthropy, and so forth. So we do have some sort of proxy to work from. There's also a very clear top-down quality to the conceptualization of a good citizen. Political systems ultimately teach citizens the behaviors that's expected from them. So from this project, Tim and our group of colleagues, we've actually looked at conceptualization of citizenship. And we looked at using the data we're utilizing here to understand citizenship education in China and how it influences how people perceive what a good and bad citizen is. So we draw from that material as well from our theoretical construction. There is some overlap between Western jurisdictions, and particularly Western liberal democratic institutions and authoritarian ones about what it means to be a good and bad citizen. There's this idea of the dutiful citizen. I mean, if I was tap into my philosophical background, you can go from the Kantian understanding of like who's the dutiful citizen. But ultimately, there's this idea that citizens, if you're a part of a nation state, it is your duty to contribute to the nation state itself. So we draw from that as well, where we see a sort of a movement from Western jurisdictions to the authoritarian jurisdiction is in the authoritarian one, we often see that the good citizen is conceived as someone who's much more docile, someone who's much more submissive. So they're not active citizens, if we want to use the political science language. They're generally seen as non-active, relatively speaking, although we can critique that because, again, it's within the constructs of what it means to be an active citizen. Effectively, in obeying the law, the citizen is polite, is courteous, it embodies moral virtues of care. Those are what's most valued in this context. So effectively, we have a passive citizen in the Chinese context. That's all I'm suggesting there. Another sort of consideration that we have is perhaps China's, quote, bad citizens, those who don't volunteer, those who don't engage in philanthropic sort of activities, are basically insignificant bystanders. So effectively, they have, these are citizens in status, but they have no sense of solidarity with others. They see the need and suffering taking place, but they really don't want to take any action to help. So it is plausible that these sorts of citizens are not inherently bad citizens per se, but their badness lies in the fact that they consciously opt out of citizenship altogether. Now, we've seen this trend happening among young people, particularly in a lot of jurisdictions around the world. China's no exception to this, at least so we hypothesize. We could see that citizens might opt out of this sort of dutiful sort of citizen as a form of protest against the state, or reaction against perceived socioeconomic conditions, or worse lived opportunities. And there's also another sort of movement that we need to entertain theoretically within our framework. There's a lying flat movement in China right now. And these are individuals, notably those in their 20s, who have rejected societal pressures and to overwork and to overachieve. So effectively, they become less and less engaged citizens. So we have all of these kinds of, shall we say, social forces in play, which we try to theoretically account for in our framework. In terms of data, as I mentioned, this is work coming from the Civic Participation in China surveys in 2018, 2020, 2022, which were conducted by Tim and I and some of our co-authors. So CPCS is an online survey of urban residents looking at philanthropic and volunteering behavior and perceptions of civic engagements. I'm not going to bog too much on this, but I just wanted you to know a little bit about the data. We are using stratified random sampling techniques. We surveyed 6 urban centers, so Beijing, Changsha, Kunming, Luzhou, Shanghai, and Wuhan. So these are urban areas spanning different regional spectrums, and they vary in terms of population size and GDP. And it involves a lot of multiple choice and ranking questions. So that's a sort of methodological sort of approach. If you're super fascinated by this, we have 3 papers using this data. You can get the methodology straight out of that. You can have a methodology paper coming out, and we can talk, you can learn all about our surveys in that respect there. So what's our analytical strategy? Okay, so remember, we're trying to figure out who these bad citizens are, and conversely, who these good citizens are. What are their characteristics? And we're looking particularly in terms of charitable giving and volunteering. So at the one end are those who donate and volunteer. Those are the proverbial good citizens. At the other end are the quote bad citizens who neither give their time or their money. In the middle are those who do one but not the other, who are other donators. So they donate but they do not volunteer, or they're volunteers who volunteer but do not donate. So following research in other jurisdictions, we surmise that there's various manifestations of citizenship here that can interact with demographic characteristics, such as income, age, location, and Communist Party of China membership. So in particular, we are interested in how motivations for not giving or volunteering are shaped at 3 different levels. At the state level, so citizens' attitudes towards the state and the party. At the social organizational level, so citizens' preconceptions about non-governmental organizations and social organizations in general. And at the individual group level, the influence of citizens' social circles and their perceptions of those who engage in charitable giving and or volunteering. So effectively, the underlying idea here is that the state and the party play a crucial role in organizing civil affairs in China. On another level, we suggest that social organizations have played an increasingly prominent role and public role in the realms of volunteerism and charitable giving. And so we also see that NGOs are widely closely tied to acts of good citizenship. So the expectations that the respondents' attitudes towards these social organizations might affect their action or inaction. At the individual and group level, citizens' inaction can be explained by behavior of others most closely around them, i.e. their social circle. So we're looking more of their sort of sociological sort of underpinnings and see how that influences it. As I mentioned, we've run an altruistic behavior survey, which is more individual psychologically oriented. And I'll give you some insights after I turn it over to Tim about what we found about the individual characteristics. So perhaps I can pause here.
Sure.
Let you.
Yeah, you can just pass me that. Hi, everybody.
Hey, Tim.
We like to do this. Greet each other. So yeah, I'm just going to talk about first the descriptive statistics, and I'm not going to stick this up too long, but this is just sort of a sample of some of the important variables. And first and foremost, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what our sample suggests about the makeup of good citizens versus bad citizens. So, I mean, look, I guess the good news from the state's perspective is that over 50% of our sample were what we'd call good citizens, in the sense that they both volunteer and give charity, which is, yeah, it's great news, given the fact that the state has invested so much time, energy, and frankly, money into trying to convince people to do this, right? But on the flip side, 13% have done neither. And we argue that given how central sort of encouraging citizens to give and volunteer is to government policy, the fact that there are 13% actually is a pretty high number, right? Especially in the context of authoritarianism, right? Where we expect that people just do as they're told. I mean, this suggests that people don't do as they're told. Our sample also finds that 20% are what we call donators. They give money, but don't give of their time. And then 13% only give of their time, they're volunteers. So those sort of the general general numbers. Now we do multinomial logistic regression to look at what is sort of the average bad citizen. And ultimately we find the average bad citizen in China is older, which is interesting because it actually comes in conflict with our altruism survey, but we'll talk about that later. But older, childless, lives in smaller cities on a lower income, and they're not members of the Chinese Communist Party, which is quite interesting. Party membership, this is much to our, not to our surprise, as we would expect, party membership has the strongest effect on both volunteerism and charitable giving. Essentially, people who are party members are far more likely to give of their time and give of their money. But for those who do just one, not the other, they're far more likely to volunteer than give of their money. We ask the question here, well, why is that? Why would party members be far more likely, if they're choosing one, to give of their time and not of their money? And our working argument is, it's the thing that's most visible. And party members are usually far more concerned about what other party members, the people around them, actually think and perceive of their actions, right? Being a party member, to some extent, is performative, right? Like in any context, China's not an exception. If you are a real strong party member, you perform your party identity. The same thing goes here. And if you had to choose, why not volunteer time? You're out there. If you give of just money, it's not seen. It can't be so easily seen by your community members. We also find that income has a pretty strong effect. People who have lower income are less likely to give. It's not, I don't think, very shocking to learn this, right? Probably because people on lower income have less to give and potentially less free time to devote to volunteering. So it kind of works both ways. Of course, we know from the more general literature on volunteerism is that it's actually kind of a curvilinear relationship. So it's not as if it's a linear relationship that the super rich are volunteering their time. Guess what? They don't do that, right? There's like what I describe as a middle class bulge, right? In the middle class or the sort of working middle class, they're going to be more likely. And we also find that age is negatively related to the good citizen behavior. And that, like I said, is counter to our expectations and actually counter to the follow-up survey that we did. But how do we describe this particular finding? It might be that, I mean, we do know this to be true. Chinese elderly tend to be far more financially vulnerable, in part because of the way that the state does or actually does not take care of the elderly. Yeah. It's fine.
Just a clarification question, your measure of outcome, how is the survey question worded exactly? Did you put a time limit, like have you ever volunteered in the past year, or just have you ever volunteered?
Yeah, so this dependent variable is just, have you volunteered, right? We have, we have other measures in the survey, but the one that we use here is, have you volunteered? Yeah. Which is interesting, of course, because if you're talking to an old person, it means if they said no, that they've never done it, right? But that actually is not surprising, because both philanthropic giving and voluntaristic activity is kind of a sort of a newer thing, okay? Those are the results there, but I'm not going to dwell on that. So I want to move now to the results on the three levels that Reza talked about, right? We're really interested in sort of the relationship between how a respondent sort of experiences, perceives the state, which is really important because it's the state who's trying to get people to do these things, the way that it perceives NGOs, because typically, both in China, but around the world, both charitable giving and voluntaristic activity has frequently been associated with non-governmental organizations. And then, of course, social circle, because there's plenty of literature that suggests that people tend to kind of mimic what is happening around them, okay? So we use logit models to test the association between these key independent variables. So donates and volunteers, right? And we have these, obviously outcomes of various kinds, right? Those who are going to be donating and volunteering, donating, not volunteering, blah, 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 blah. So yes, those four. And the explanatory variables that are going to relate to those things that I mentioned, the state, NGOs, and social circle. And I'll talk about how we developed those explanatory variables. And then we are controlling for potential confounding variables like gender, age, party membership, location, which obviously we talked about earlier in the descriptive statistics. And so we report these log odd ratios here. This particular one on the right-hand side is going to reflect the questions relating to the state, perceptions of the state, and perceptions of NGOs. So the first, you can see it's a binary, it's based upon two questions. The first question relates to, do they believe that the government sufficiently helps those who are disadvantaged? And then the second is essentially, do you support the government and the party? And then you obviously have three different potential pairs, right? Here, so 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1. And then the same thing goes for NGOs, very similar types of questions. So do you believe that there is, it's a little bit different, the first one. Do you believe that NGOs are needed to help the disadvantaged in society? And then the second question relates to essentially, do you support NGOs and the activities that they do? What we find here, quite interesting, starting with the state, we expected the relationship or sort of perceptions of the state to have the strongest relationship in affecting ultimately whether someone gives or volunteers. Again, that makes sense. You would expect in an authoritarian context, and especially in the Chinese context, because the state is making this central to the way that it shapes this notion of citizenship. What we find is any expression of non-support to the state had a negative effect on donation behavior. So essentially, people who were less supportive of the state were actually far less likely to give and volunteer. Those who are most critical and most unsupportive of the state were more likely to not donate than those who were least critical and more supportive. It makes sense based upon our expectation. What is sort of more surprising to us is that of the three levels that we look at, this is the weakest. The weakest relationship is with the state. The effect, incidentally, on volunteering was even greater, right? So, but it's in similar directions. So what is this relationship between good citizens and support for the state and bad citizens and non-support suggest? What we argue in the paper is that it suggests that citizens link voluntaristic activity and charitable giving with the state. And that's by parties' design. The state wants them to make that link, right? The state has been telling citizens, you should be engaging in this activity. And guess what? Citizens essentially are saying, all right, we get it. Voluntaristic activity and charitable giving is a state thing, is a party thing. So that's great, right? Of course, it's great if you support the party, but it's not so great if you don't support the party from the party's standpoint, right? It could make those who don't support the state even less likely to be good citizens because it's linking those ideas so closely together. If you want to be part of the lying flat generation, as Reza pointed out, and you want to silently register your discontent with the government, you don't volunteer and you don't give charity. Yeah.
I'm sorry if you said it or if it's actually obvious, but is actually giving and volunteering linked to state in practice? That volunteering in state organization or is it really different than each they're just making this link?
Oh, you mean in terms of like who they're giving money to?
Yeah, who do you actually
It's a really good question. The reality is that the way that the state has begun to shape its regulatory framework for something like charitable giving, it makes it more and more difficult for people to give to actors that are outside of the realm of the state, right? And actually previous work, some by us, but also by other scholars, has found that when people are giving to organizations, they're far more likely to give to government organized non-governmental organizations or gongos than non-governmental organized non-governmental organizations. So kind of, indirectly, but we would argue by state design. The state intends this to happen, right? They don't have to force people to give to state favored organizations or volunteer for state. When we talk about volunteerism, it's a good point. It's a good question because when we talk about volunteerism, if you're doing it because you want to stay within the favor of the party, you're doing this as a performative act, you're going to be volunteering for maybe a party favored organization or something like the Olympics. Or you're going to be volunteering in times of a natural disaster, something that's very visible that is actually kind of linked to the party. So it's a great question.
So yeah, we actually have a paper that should be coming out soon. It's on a journal one, looking at state-led versus citizen-led volunteerism, and it's really interesting because we do find there that citizens are more likely to engage in state-led ones because it's seen as performative and it's that they're a good citizen and usually it's your social circle that matters the most. In fact, Tim's
you're just giving away
the punchlines, but effectively that's what we found in that paper as well.
Yeah.
So,
and just about that.
Sure.
Do they understand volunteering as the state one maybe? The possibility that they understand like do you volunteer as only for the state because it's a survey?
Like how do they conceive of it?
Yeah, maybe they do volunteering on organization against states, but they don't consider that volunteering in the world.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Yeah.
So I'm gonna put on my moderator hat and say,
It's too much.
I'm gonna implore you to please not interrupt, let them finish the presentation or whatever questions you have, we can ask them.
To be
We may
fair.
run the risk of them not
Yeah.
finishing,
Yeah.
that's all right. No, that's fine, we can answer that,
No,
but
no, it's fine.
can we wait until the presentation is finished? Great.
Uh,
fantastic. No, you can respond to that, it's just maybe after that.
It's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question. We'll come back. Yeah. No, it's a great question. It's something that we thought a lot about. Yeah. So how about with NGOs? So just to remind you, we had these 3 response combinations, right? This question we ask about belief that NGOs are needed to support vulnerable individuals. And then also citizens should support NGOs. We find, interestingly enough, that support for NGOs alone had little effect on donating. And actually, in a way that sort of helps us get to this question that has been raised already, like, that they might be associating it with the state, right? But those agreeing that NGOs are not needing and also don't think citizens should support NGOs were 2.5 times more likely to not donate. So actually there is something about a belief in or lack of belief in NGOs and the efficacy that is behind the bad citizen. At least that's what it suggests. There are very similar results, by the way, for volunteering, right? And I should add that the views of the NGOs had a stronger effect than what we found for the state, but not as Reza so unkindly revealed our most exciting result. Yeah, I mean, what it suggests to us is that bad citizens do infer like a strong linkage between NGOs and charitable giving, at least to some extent, maybe not as strongly as we would have expected, but there is some relationship there that we would have expected. But as Reza said, I'll never let you forget this. Citizens' social circle has the strongest impact on their behavior, okay? Those who, and you'll see this depicted on the log odds here on the right-hand side, those who do not have friends or family engaged in these activities are significantly less likely to do so themselves. It's an odds ratio of 8.09. It's a really significant effect. So why is this effect so strong? There are lots of things that we explore in the paper as to why it might be so strong. But one of the things, and it gets to the title of this paper, or sorry, of this presentation, and gets to the sort of follow-up survey that Reza has talked about, is that we suspected that this might be understood by how respondents perceive the behavior itself, right? How they perceive this act of voluntaristic activity and charitable giving. So we asked this question, do they see the actions as altruistic or self-interested? So we created a proxy measure based upon questions in the survey to try to unpack this. Not as directly as the follow-up survey. That's why we did the follow-up survey, to really dig deeper. This is really something that we realized that we had within the data to try to explore. And there's some interesting results here. So chi-square tests reveal that bad citizens, again, those who don't volunteer or donate, are more likely to believe that the activities are done for self-interested reasons, which did sort of conform to what we sort of expected, that like, oh, maybe they just don't believe the activity is altruistic. They're becoming increasingly cynical about the act itself. It's important to note, though, that the difference is only significant for charitable giving, 24% versus 19%, whereas the gap is pretty small for volunteering. It's 44.68 to 43.76. Essentially, what that suggests to us is that bad citizens are more likely to believe that individuals who donate are not altruistic than good citizens. But here's what's, I think, even more interesting, which is why I put it in bold. Any student who's been in my class knows, if I put it in bold, it's really interesting. For bad and good citizens, if you look at that percentage, volunteering is seen as being a more self-interested act. The fact that 44 or 43% of people who do volunteer believe that it's a self-interested act is super interesting as far as we're concerned, right? What it suggests is a growing skepticism about the activity itself. They're doing it, but they really don't believe that it's altruistic.
It's so fast, although you said it's a new activity.
Yeah.
You reached there 100 years after.
Right. I should note here, good citizens who believe they're doing so. So just looking at good citizens, which that's not the focus of this paper, but good citizens who believe they're doing so for altruistic reasons, believe that other people are also being altruistic, right?
So you think that self-interest is bad?
No, absolutely not. I would never say that to you, Adam. Definitely not. No, absolutely.
Because that would mean that you're
No, it's right. No, absolutely not. No, this is a non-normative paper. Not a bad thing, but why it could be potentially bad, doing things purely for self-interest, or the perception that is purely for self-interest, could potentially degrade the value of it from the perspective of citizenship building, right? That you don't want, the state doesn't necessarily want to build or construct a citizen who's doing things purely out of their self-interest. At least they want we would argue, the illusion that, or the naive belief that this is for the good of the community. Like I already suggested, the belief about that motivation. Oh wait, I didn't suggest this. Sorry, now I'm suggesting it. Maybe I did, I don't know. It's been a long day already. The belief about this, this is what we're going to argue. So that motivation thing is super interesting. The finding is super interesting. And yet, what we actually find is that the belief about that motivation, whether it's altruistic or self-interested, is highly sensitive to one social circle. Essentially, what we find is it's that really strong effect about the people around you, what they're doing, that's actually impacting the answer to the motivation. So amongst those who see charitable donating as an altruistic act and report having no relatives or friends who donate are 11 times more likely to not donate. So really strong effect of the social circle. It's clear that as far as we're concerned, it's clear that the skepticism about motivation relates to the people who you're around, right? It's related to your social circle, your community, which is not terribly surprising, right? It suggests to us that Chinese citizens don't care much about what strangers think. And actually, there's a literature that supports that they care far more about the people around them and what the people around them think. It's interesting because I think we look at this and be like, yeah, no shit. But and I don't know what the literature is saying about other contexts, but you look at social media, people absolutely care about what strangers think about them, right? They absolutely do, right? How many likes do I get? I don't know. We're not do that research, but it does occur to me that there is something about people caring about strangers in other contexts that doesn't seem to be going on here. So what are the, oh, that's you, or is it me?
Next one, implications?
Yes, that's you.
All right, so Tim's off the hook for a while. What does this all mean? That's what I'm going to talk about. So theoretically, of course, we're delving greater and greater into what the bad citizens' characteristics are. But as I mentioned beforehand, there's some key policy issues here. And the first one, the first sort of top line argument to make is this: a key factor to explain the bad citizens, not that they're bad per se, rather they're not necessarily altruistic citizens. They're not altruistic individuals. It is plausible that we're seeing the development of a more skeptical citizen towards state behavior. Now, we use the word skeptical as a side note because there's literature on the critical citizen, and we didn't want to delve deeper into that because it's usually looking at Western democracies. So we're looking at a very skeptical sort of citizen who are not necessarily altruistic, who've woken up to the idea that maybe the state's messaging may not actually attune to what their realities are. But from a policy standpoint, of course, there's some major issues if I'm the state. First, if the state wants to actually influence bad citizens, appealing to moralistic or altruistic appeals is not going to be very effective for this cohort. So what we see here is having these grandiose kind of slogans that a good citizen does this, or having these sorts of mass appeals for volunteerism or philanthropy. It's not going to directly shape or shift the behavior of these bad citizens. So again, moralistic and altruistic appeals do not appeal to them very much. What does appeal to them is influencing their immediate social networks. It's much more effective in changing their behavior than larger propagandistic sort of campaigns that the party really utilizes. Now, we don't really delve too much into this into the paper, but China's social media can be used to a great effect to influence how people perceive the good and bad citizen. So there are tools at the state's disposal to shift this. The state's not doing that at this stage. This is not to say this is the recipe for the state to do that. Actually, we are giving the recipe for the state to do that. But it says the campaign that the state's utilizing to address what a good citizen should be, it's not meeting those bad citizens at all. What they should do is actually use social media to influence their social circles, to actually influence it. That would be much more targeted and much more influential. So I think that's a sort of the bigger sort of picture for looking within the Chinese context. Now, this is where it becomes a bit more complex. It becomes complex because, as Tim mentioned, we had this idea of this altruistic citizen, and we sort of developed a proxy using our existing database, which was over 3 waves, and there's going to be a 4th wave now. But we weren't satisfied with that because it was not a survey that was designed to test the altruistic citizen. So we figured, let's just do that. Let's just actually create a survey that looks at the socio-psychological profile of the altruistic individual. So we ran the Chinese altruistic behavior survey. I'll give you some insights into some of our preliminary sort of analysis. What we suggest here is that citizens who are more likely to perform altruistic acts are older age cohorts, are party members. In fact, compared to party members, non-party members declare that they're less likely to give out a larger share if they receive 1,000 yuan. So it's this classic experiment that economists run. If I give you $100, for example, and I say to you, a stranger gives you $100, the only caveat is you need to give part of that $100 to someone, another stranger. How much would you give? The underlying idea here is if you give 0, that means you're not very beautiful. If you give 100, you're very beautiful. So we try to run this within our experiment here. And we saw that that party members are much more dutiful. They're more likely to give using this sort of canonical sort of experiment than non-party members. So it suggests to us that party membership does play a role. And Tim's talked about the sort of performance that party members might want to play. Yeah, so it's really interesting from that standpoint. We also see comparatively individuals working for private companies and social organizations are more likely to donate. Those who have higher family income, over 20,000 yuan over a month, are more likely to donate. Those who live in larger cities are more likely as well. So we're also exploring psychological factors that might affect participation or non-participation. So we've developed an index on relationships, an index on social awareness. There's a loneliness index, which adapted from the UCLA's loneliness surveys, and a subjective happiness. Those are things that we're looking to see characteristics of how this altruistic citizen might look like effectively. The preliminary sort of data that we've analyzed suggests that females, elderly people, people with higher levels of education, and again, party members are more likely to declare that they're happier. And because they're happier, they're somewhat more likelier to actually engage in some sort of civic engagement. We've also disaggregated by effective altruism, values-based altruism, and proximity-based altruism. And here we start to see, again, party members are consistent across. So there's something here that the good citizen and the party member are hand in hand in many respects. So surprise, surprise. Yeah. So it's interesting that we're seeing that. And again, I think that's where we are with this project. So we have this paper, which we've sort of presented. We have this new data set, which we're trying to explore how to utilize. And then we have a new wave of this new civic participation survey, which maybe we may incorporate at some point in our future papers. So thank you for allowing us to say a few words about this.
Thanks, everybody.